So the topic of sales is near and dear to my heart. Unfortunately, we know it's not near and dear to everyone else's heart. Has anybody loved sales that's on this workshop with us today? Can we see a show of hands?
Well, they might be muted too.
All right, they might be muted. Okay. So, you know, again, sales is not people's, don't really fall in love with it. If you could move to the next slide for me, please, I would appreciate it. See, the first thing I want to do is address the truth about sales, and the truth is that you've been lied to. And yes, I said it, you've been lied to. And you're going to be very surprised when I tell you what I mean by that statement. See, the biggest reason people say they don't like sales, and mostly they say they hate sales, is because they think selling is about trying to get someone to do something they don't want to do. And this is the most common complaint I hear. It's the reason that most people avoid selling and learning to sell altogether. So let's address it right up front. So the statement, people think selling is about trying to get someone to do something they don't want to do, is 100% true. The fact that a person who enters into a sales conversation with you and doesn't want to buy is actually not a problem. And many people think that it is a problem, but it's an obstacle. It's not a problem, and there are two different things. They are two different things. See, a problem is something that exists and it shouldn't be there. An obstacle is something that exists and it's just there. And you have to move around it or overcome it somehow before the end of your sales conversation, or you're always going to have objections. So selling contains obstacles, not problems. There is nothing wrong with trying to get a person to buy something, particularly if they benefit from it. And this is so very, very true that many people, and I'm sure each of you have been to networking events or you've been on Zoom calls for the last 6-7 months, and the first thing people want to do is they want to try to sell their product or service to you instead of building a relationship, number one, and talking to you about your needs or services or how they can benefit you. The only thing masterful selling requires is that you learn to love the experience of having conversations with people. Now, generally, when I do a workshop and I talk about falling in love with people, at the end of the workshop, most people tell me, when I say WDWL, what did we learn? They say, Celeste, I have to fall in love with people. And sales is falling in love with people. And the reason we hate sales, and we don't necessarily hate people, but we hate the conversations. But it's so important to fall in love with people, even with your sales conversations. Because by loving people, people are going to love you back. See, the actual definition of conversation is the informal exchange of ideas through spoken words. And the number one rule in my book is if you want to stop failing at sales, stop trying to sell people via the written word. Now, what do I mean by that? Sales is not, you're not going to sell people through an email, a text, a social media post, an Instagram post. You know, what you're going to have to do is build a relationship with these people and how you can help and serve people. You know, in my 36 years in the direct selling industry, in the franchise that I was with, I had to teach people how to earn the right to own a franchise. They couldn't buy a franchise. They had to earn the right through sales. And they earned that right through building relationships and learning to have conversations. And so most people were interested because of opportunity, recognition, and money. But the one component that I missed for 36 years that I thoroughly understand the last 7 years that I've been in consulting is you have to serve your people first. When you serve people first and you build the relationships and you help these people, it works easier for you in having these conversations to help these people want to do business with you, like, want, and trust you. So you need to invite people into a conversation. And what I mean is spoken words. There are 3 different kinds of conversations you can have. And these are really in-depth conversations, and I'm going to highlight these. But again, any Q&A, or I'd be glad to have conversations with your particular business afterwards. So the first conversation is what we call the salutation or the chit-chat. And this is really an informal conversation, and it's not planned. You put no thought into it, and it's on the spot. And it's an informal conversation that you have with people. The second conversation is the content conversation. It starts with rapport building. Then you get into the heart of the conversation. So it's very important in the rapport conversation that you do build good rapport with people. And that means that you are not talking about yourself. The more you get people to talk about themselves, the better the rapport you're going to build with those people. One of Dale Carnegie's #1 thing is people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, is to ask questions to get people to talk about themselves. So many times we get into a rapport conversation and we want to say, I this, I that, I do this, I do that, I. That's not rapport building. Rapport building is about the other person. The third conversation is the opportunity conversation, offering some opportunity to buy or work with you. It's the only kind of conversation where a sale is most likely to happen. And what happens is most of the time, people don't wait to the opportunity conversation to sell. They start selling in the chit chat or the salutation, or they start selling in the rapport building conversations. And really where you want to sell is in the opportunity conversation. So there is a right place and a wrong place to have a sales conversation. The reason you have not been selling your service successfully for most people is because very likely of one major factor. You are trying to sell in the wrong conversation. We call it the opportunity conversation because during this conversation, there's a call to action. And a lot of times people need to know exactly what their call to action is, and they need to be consistent with their call to action. And then you can vary and have maybe 1 or 2 different call to actions based on the networking group or the Zoom conversation or the Zoom networking group that you're attending. But so many times people get out there and they just, off the seat of their pants, offer a different type of call to action. You have to be confident in the call to actions that you're offering. And I suggest that you have 1 or 2 call to actions, but primarily you have your go-to call to action. And then occasionally maybe there's a second call to action that you may offer instead of your first call to action. And you must extend an opportunity, also known as an invitation, so the prospect can take the next step with you. So this is probably one of my most favorite things about sales is inviting objections. And you know what I'd love for you to do in the chat box is I'd love for you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the best, how many of you love inviting objections? And if you don't like objections, then you're down there, you know, of 1 to 5 or something like that. And share with us why you don't like objections. See, the reason most people hate objections is because they're afraid of them or they try to avoid them. And that is very often what ruins a sale. You need to be very confident in inviting objections. Objections are a normal part of an opportunity conversation, and you should expect them. They're going to be there. And the key is to invite them before they show up in the conversation. So, you know, one of the things that I encourage you to do, and we have different perspectives of fields on this workshop with us here today, is if you haven't done this in a while, write down your top 10 objections that you get when you have a sales conversation. You should be able to know your top 10 objections, and you should know the solution to those objections before they come up. And one of the things is that people need to learn, and this is such an in-depth thing that I teach, you have to learn to weave these objections into your sales conversations where you're inviting them out in a normal conversation. Maybe some of those objections will come out in the chit-chat or the salutary conversation. Maybe they will come out in the rapport building. So you're splashing them all throughout your conversations. So when you get into your sales conversation, you're not just asking a bunch of questions that you get a lot of repetitive objections. And then when you're ready to ask them to buy, you're getting a bunch of negativity or objections that maybe you can't overcome. And the reasons you want to bring these out and invite these out during the opportunity conversation and before is so they don't become objections when you ask them to purchase or buy your service or product. And this is so, so important. So what are some of the objections you get when you're having opportunity conversations? I'd love for you to put it in the chat of what are some of the objections that you get. And I would imagine that most common objections sometimes is time, money, spouse, I have to think about it. I mean, each of you know what are some of the objections you have. So when you know that, you need to know when to weave that in your conversations so they don't come out in the last part of your sales conversation when you want to ask them to buy, that you've already overcome those objections. So there's another thing that I teach, and again, I can't teach everything in a short period of time, but in these sales conversations, when you invite objections, there's a thing that I call key commitments. So when you ask a question and that you're inviting objection out and they answer, then there's a thing as a key commitment that what you want to do is you want to commit and recommit that question. Sometimes you'll repeat that answer back to them so they say yes. And you're saying, well, why would you do that, Celeste? See, people genuinely want to tell you the truth. They don't intentionally want to lie to you. But how many of you have had a conversation with people and they've said yes, 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 and then you get down to the end and when you ask them to buy and they come back and say, oh, I have to think about that, or I have to ask my spouse. So when you invited those objections out, if you didn't offer a key commitment, which means it's a tie down, that you ask that question and you recommit, now they know that they have really committed to the truth. Where if you just ask that question and they say something and then you move on, you didn't really recommit, so it comes back up in the end, and then they're saying, and you're saying, well, I know I asked that question, and you probably did ask that question, and you probably did overcome it, but you didn't recommit it to them for them to tell you yes instead of no. You just left it there. So write down all the objections you can think of and think of what questions you could ask the person. That is going to bring out the objection during the conversation. And write down how you're going to phrase your response so that thing you're selling solves that objection. So some of the key points here are obstacles, and that obstacles are not problems. You know, I love objections, and I know in order to get a sale, I have to invite objections out in all of my conversations. So I fall in love with people, and I fall in love with obstacles and inviting objections because I don't want that to come out in the end. Because one of the things about obstacles not being problems is at the end, when you ask somebody to purchase your product or service, there's only one thing that you can control. You can't control at that point, I have to think about it, I have to talk to my spouse, I don't have time, or all those other objections. You can't control that in the close. The only thing you can control at the close when you ask somebody to purchase something from you is money. And that's another avenue all in itself where whatever your product or services is, where it's X amount of dollars, you've got to break those dollars down into daytime compartments that during your conversations that you bring those figures up, and then you bring it up to a weekly, a monthly, or a weekly or a daily investment of what your services is that they can afford to spend that kind of money, because otherwise they're going to say, I can't afford that. So money objections is something you have to weave into your conversation, knowing your price of your product or service and breaking it down. So some of the other key points are spoken conversations are key, 3 different sales conversations, inviting objections, and mini script. So my gift to you is for you to crack your bank code at www.mybankcode.com/Giordano. Also a 30-minute, or really I'd like to make this a 1-hour discovery phone session at celestegiordano.com. Also, those are my social media outlets right there that you're welcome to follow me. I would love for you to follow me. I do a weekly blog that comes out every Thursday at 9:30 in the morning, and it has a lot of sales content, leadership content, servant heart content, and love to have you be a member of that and to get that weekly blog or newsletter about sales.